You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend. You are listening to episode 169 of the Business for Good podcast. Now, normally on this show, we feature CEOs or investors from companies seeking to use commerce to make the world a better place. But longtime listeners will know that I occasionally also have on authors who write about topics of interest to the show, such as books about entrepreneurship, investing, and in the case of today's show, a great new book profiling many of the startups seeking to build a better food and agriculture system. For those who listen often, you know that I can be quite a fan of using technology to solve our food and agriculture problems, and that I can also sometimes be quite skeptical of claims about so-called natural or organic or regenerative agriculture offering any real promise to feed the world sustainably. Well, we all love reading anything that affirms our belief, and the guest for this episode's new book certainly did that for me. It affirmed my beliefs, so how nice for me. In this episode, I am joined by one of America's most thoughtful national journalists, Mike Grunwald. I say he's thoughtful not just because I often find myself in agreement with him, that is certainly true, but because Mike really is a data-driven guy who is passionate about protecting the planet while trying to go wherever the math takes him, even if that leads him to hold unpopular opinions about how best to feed the world without frying the planet, as Mike has said many times himself. You may know Mike from his work at Time Magazine or Politico or the Washington Post. He's also now a New York Times contributing opinion commentator, or from his critically acclaimed books about the Obama administration and the history of the Everglades. He also was a host for a show called Climavores that I really enjoyed while it was on as a podcast as well. But for the purpose of this episode, Mike is here to discuss his third book, which is entitled, We Are Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate. The book is now out, and you can get it anywhere books are sold. In this sweeping and deeply reported book, Mike tackles one of the most uncomfortable truths of our time, that our global food system, especially animal farming, is the leading driver of climate change, deforestation, wildlife extinction, and more. But rather than simply use the book as an opportunity to doomscroll through the apocalypse, We Are Eating the Earth offers a clear-eyed, often witty, and ultimately hopeful exploration of how we might transform our food system to produce more food while using fewer resources. In our conversation, Mike and I discussed some of the biggest food and climate myths, like whether organic or so-called regenerative agriculture is necessarily better for the planet, as well as Mike's views on what will actually work to slash humanity's footprint on our Earth. Spoiler, eat less meat, waste less food, and use fewer biofuels are among his biggest points. Again, eat less meat, waste less food, and use fewer biofuels. That's basically the takeaway. Now, Mike also clarifies in this conversation his views on animal welfare after writing a highly controversial opinion piece in the New York Times that seemed to be promoting factory farming. And he talks also about his views on the welfare of chickens and pigs, and his lack of concern about falling fertility rates. It's a wide-ranging conversation that's got something for everyone interested in a future with fewer hungry people and more land rewilded. So let me let Mike make the case himself. Mike, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Oh, Paul, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
I really enjoyed the book, but admittedly, any book about agricultural policy that has references both to Monty Python and to the Naked Gun, it's my type of book. So I appreciate it. It's like very Grunwaldian humor. As somebody who's read actually all of your books and has listened to your podcasts, I feel like I know you better than many people who might not have consumed your content as voraciously as I have. So it was very like Grunwaldian humor, along with I would call it more like the broccoli of public policy. You got like broccoli of public policy, but the chocolate of all these jokes in there. So I appreciated that.
Oh, thanks. I tried to make the medicine go down. And I got to say for your listeners that Paul has been an incredible guide for me on these issues. Like I met you right when I was just starting the reporting, and you've been kind and wise, and I've learned so much.
Oh, that's very generous of you. Yeah, I remember when we first met, it was at a Good Food Institute event in San Francisco, and we were bonding over our shared lamentation of the move away from the use of the term clean for clean meat. And people wanted to move to, at that time, cell-based meat, which thankfully was also later discarded. Very few people want to eat cells, it turned out. Who knew? But the idea that clean meat never really took on, still, even to this day, years later, seems like a shame to me. But it's a very lonely lamentation that I have today.
Yeah, and how crazy was that conference, right? I mean, that was like there were like legitimate debates about whether meat was going to disappear in 10 or 15 or 20 years, right? Right.
Yeah,
My
Well,
line is that I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A in the drinks line.
yeah, no, it's a good line. I noticed that line in the book. I definitely liked it, and that was funny. So why don't we start there, Mike? In the book, you chronicle those heady days of when Beyond Meat IPO'd in 2019, and then you saw them have a huge pop, and money started flowing into this space, especially reaching its apex in 2021. Like it was like this river of cash flowing into alt meat land, with projections from experts that you're alluding to here. But I mean, you pointed them out in the book. Like you had some experts saying that within a decade, 10% of meat was going to be animal free, and there's just going to be this major takeover. Now, in fairness, at that time, plant-based milk was already over 10% plant-based. Excuse me, the fluid milk market was over 10% plant-based. So I don't think it was like that crazy. But as you point out in the book, all of a sudden valuations collapse, major layoffs, bankruptcies, investor losses, and more. These projections from 2019 through 2021 did not, or at least so far, have not come to fruition. What's your diagnosis for why this happened? I'm going to ask you what your prescription is for how to get the mojo back, but what do you think happened that caused that?
Well, part of it, I mean, right, some of it is classic, just like Gardner hype cycle, right? The peak of inflated expectations to be followed by the trough of disillusionment. But I do think, and I tried to emphasize this some of the book, and this is maybe the larger theme of the book, is that there was this idea in 2019 at that conference, but I think generally regarding alt meat and alternatives to the status quo in agriculture and meat generally, that this cannot hold. Right. I remember in 2019, the fires were burning in California, and we were in San Francisco, and there was literally a kind of like dark cloud over the hotel where we were hanging out. And there was just this notion. I mean, there was also a swine flu that was wiping out hundreds of millions of pigs in China. And what I kept hearing was this stuff has to work, because ultimately, and this is what we'll talk about, this is kind of, this is what I spent 6 years working on, but that animal agriculture, agriculture in general, but animal agriculture in particular it's eating so much of the earth, right? That 2/3 of all agricultural land is pasture, that 3/4 of agricultural land is used for livestock in some form. Yeah. And that it's 70% of our fresh water. It's all this water pollution and water shortages and deforestation and wetland drainage, that there had to be some kind of alternative. And suddenly you had Beyond Meat, which at the time was like, it had gone to $250 a share. It was worth a third as much as Tyson, right? And everybody was like, this is it. This is great. And nobody had really tried to make vegan food for non-vegans before, right? And people were like, this is cool. It's different. A lot of the people saying it were vegans and maybe could tell it was better than their old hockey puck burgers, but maybe didn't know if it was as good as meat. And it turned out it wasn't. But I think the excitement was understandable. There was real innovation, but ultimately, I think to take on meat, you're going to have to be better and cheaper than meat, just like Tesla was for taking on the internal combustion engine. And that hasn't really happened yet in alt meat land, as you call it.
Yeah, and in fairness, Tesla hasn't become cheaper either, though, right? Like Tesla has done pretty well, becoming better than conventional cars, but not necessarily cheaper, right? Like
it's pretty competitive, though, for a sports car, for what it is. I mean, and I mean, they've put together a really excellent product that people want just for the product, not because they're trying to save the earth, not because they have anything against gasoline, just because they think it's a cool, fast, fun to drive, at least somewhat affordable car. And and that hasn't happened yet on the meat side.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you that it hasn't happened on the meat side. It is pretty interesting, though, that Tesla has had the success that it has had without being cheaper yet. And yet, like if you look at the ways that animals have been displaced in the economy in the past, like sometimes it is by something being cheaper. So, you take kerosene displacing the whaling for whale oil, right? Like kerosene was a lot cheaper than whale oil, so people switched over very quickly. But other types of displacement, it's not like a car or what was then called a horseless carriage was cheaper than a horse, right? Like cars at first were not cheaper. When metal fountain pens displaced quills for writing, it's not like metal fountain pens were cheaper. And it wasn't that somebody came up with something that was like a synthetic quill and you couldn't tell the difference, but it just happened to be cheaper. Right. It was just better, right? You didn't.
It was a better mousetrap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Like you didn't have to dip your quill into an inkwell. You didn't have to sharpen it. You could write uninterrupted. Like it was just a lot better. Same thing when telegraphs displaced pigeons. Like it's not that it was necessarily cheaper. It's just that it was way better. And so I agree with you. I think from a food perspective, like you definitely need to get cheaper. I think so. But what if it were that we could just create products that were much better? Do you think there's a path to success that doesn't involve getting cheaper? Or do you think that that's necessary?
Well, I think ultimately to compete on a commodity scale, you're going to have to get price competitive. I mean, you look, Tesla again is a great example, right? Their first car, the Roadster, was like $120,000. And then the Model S was like $80,000. And then the Model 3 was like $45,000. And so it's coming down that cost curve with more volume. You start to get cheaper and you start to appeal to a larger mass market. And I do think that's, you're starting to see it on some of the, on the cultivated meat, right? You see like a company like Vow, which is making this kind of Japanese quail and selling it as this kind of foie gras premium product. I do think that you'll see companies like Blue Nalu is trying to make bluefin tuna toro, which is maybe a niche product, but it goes for like $100 a pound. So that's a lot easier to start with than competing with like chicken for a couple dollars a pound.
Yeah, right? It's kind of, so maybe
that is a, look, some of the biofuel companies thought they could do that, right? They started out selling face creams that were really expensive to replace petroleum. And then the idea was maybe they would come down and do some kind of food to replace carbohydrates, and then ultimately get down to hydrocarbons. And most of them didn't get past face creams. So, there's no guarantee, but that is, I think, a kind of sensible way to go. Others are starting out trying to develop, pharmaceutical products anyway, I think there are a lot of ways to go, but I think ultimately, if you're talking about competing in the food space, people are going to have to be able to afford to eat it.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, replacing quills with fountain pens and replacing, burgers with something else. Like it's clearly, I think is going to have to be at least price competitive and probably
right. I mean, as you know, I'm not as good as you, but I have quit beef. And because that is beef is the baddie on these things. It's like from a planetary perspective, not an animal welfare perspective, but it's 7 to 10 times more land use and more emissions than chicken or pork. But I miss it. Beef is an awesome product. I mean, it's really great. It comes in many awesome forms, and somebody who's going to try to compete with it is going to have to make their own really awesome product.
Yeah. In fairness, though, I mean, you point out in the book that per capita beef consumption in the U.S. has really plummeted in the last 50 years in the United States, whereas per capita chicken consumption skyrocketed, right? So people have largely switched from beef to chicken in the United States. And it's not like people switched from beef to chicken because they thought chicken tasted like beef. They switched because they thought chicken was cheaper and they had a perception that it was healthier. So the question is is there some other non-animal meat that you could create that even if it doesn't mimic some form of animal protein, but even if it was just cheaper and healthy, would people be amenable to switching? I don't know the answer to that. I think that mycelium is one possible option for that, actually.
Definitely. And like you always say, one of your, and you have a real, I think Beyond kind of tried this, maybe they got out a little over their skis, but trying to sell themselves as a healthy product before they really were. But you really have a good rap about how you've got, right, like more potassium than bananas, and more protein than beef, and more. You'll remind me, but you've got a like naturally healthy product. And one of the cool things about technology that I always say, people sometimes don't like it when I say this, because I think there's this kind of pristine idea that like we don't want technology in our food. But you can make it healthier, right? Like you can put in more omegas. You can, you can add more protein. You can do it with less sodium. You can, you can experiment. And that's why, right, we've got these like devices in our pocket that can, we can chat with anybody anywhere in the world and, take cool video and look up any fact known to mankind and use it as a flashlight. And a few years ago, nobody would have said all of those things are possible. But, we have really smart people working on alternatives to meat, and, maybe they'll come up with some really cool things.
Yeah, I agree. And just as an aside, I was talking with somebody recently who claimed that he had the idea that this other company was doing, but he had the idea first. And I said to him, I was like, it's like me saying I had the idea for a supercomputer in your pocket before Apple. It doesn't mean I made the iPhone, right? Like having the idea is the easy part. The idea that you could have something that did all the things that you just enumerated. Oh yeah, and it's a flashlight and a calculator. It's like, I mean, this is like every device that Radio Shack sold back in the 90s, all in one device that fits in your pocket. Anyway, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. What I should also say, like, this stuff is hard. Like when you talk about it, we say like, oh, it's easy. Just make a better meat. It's like, look, it's hard. You've been working on it and you're doing a great job. But meat has been, our ancestors started eating it 2 million years ago. We kind of evolved to love it. And it's, there are all kinds of incumbent advantages. They have the infrastructure, they have the subsidies, it's going to be difficult to really move the needle on meat alternatives. But, those problems that my book is about and that we talked about in 2019, they're not getting any better. So we still kind of got to fix them.
Right. Yeah. Soberingly so. And trust me, I wish that human nature were different. I would be thrilled if people didn't crave meat as much as we do. But it's obvious that people do love meat, as evidenced by the fact that even most people who become vegetarian stop being vegetarian. Right. Like there's just clearly, it's a sobering thing, sadly. But you mentioned.
I should say, I do admit in the book, I quit eating beef 4 years ago, but I went and did a bunch of reporting on Brazilian cattle ranches, and I cheated and I had, some really delicious steaks, and I've been good. I've been good ever since. Yeah. But again, we all kind of find the level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with.
I like that line. However, the question, Mike, is, did you pay for them? Did you pay for the steaks, or were they free? Because you might have been like a freegan, like a beef freegan, if that was the case.
I paid for them.
Oh, okay, all right. So let me just double click on this, Mike, because in some of your interviews and commentaries, it's like you kind of present yourself, you call yourself an eco mercenary, right? Like you are, you're saying, hey, it's not like I'm this environmental fanatic. I put the solar panels on to get money. I did the EV because I wanted the rebate. But in reality, between us, there's nobody else listening. Like, you wrote a book about the decimation of the Florida Everglades. You wrote a book about Obama's Green New Deal, and now you're writing a book about how agriculture is destroying the planet. And you're saying that you try to avoid personally eating beef. Like, I get the sense that you actually are somebody who really does deeply care. You're not a disinterested journalist who has no interest in the topic, but that you actually do care about the planet and its future habitability for humans and for wildlife as well. So how did you get interested in this, right? Like, how did you actually think, oh, I want to start becoming a journalist who focuses on climate and other environmental issues?
Yeah, you got me. I guess I actually do care about this stuff. I always say that it's like, this is like a really nice planet. It's got pizza and reliable Wi-Fi and breathable air. right? We should try to protect it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I really I stumbled into, I've been a policy reporter for 30 years and doing all kinds of, back starting when I was at the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and then Politico Magazine, writing about all kinds of economic issues, government issues, political issues. But really for starting when I stumbled into the Everglades, and even before that, I stumbled into the Army Corps of Engineer, thanks to this guy named Tim Searchinger, who perhaps will come up a little again later. But he gave me a tip about the Army Corps of Engineers that I spent a year kicking around their crazy, environmentally destructive and economically ridiculous water projects in the Washington Post. That really led me into first the Everglades, where, as you said, I wrote a book called The Swamp and became at least a part-time environmental reporter, which, around the time after my first book was done, that meant being a climate reporter. And so like while I was at Time Magazine, at one point I was writing a column about energy. So I thought I knew a lot about the climate, but I realized I didn't know anything about the food part of climate. And it turns out to be a third of the climate problem. I tell the story in the book of how I did write that. I wrote this magazine story about my own green life, about my solar panels and my electric car. And I had a throwaway line about how I don't unplug my computer at night. And I still eat meat. So all these kind of I'm not an eco saint, like you said. And I realized that I didn't know if eating meat was actually bad for the climate. And this was 6-7 years ago. And so I called Tim Searchinger, who I knew was doing some agriculture and climate stuff. And I had to ask him if meat was bad for the climate. And he said, yes. And then he said, duh, because that's kind of how Tim is. And that was really the beginning of my journey. He kind of explained that, that meat was a huge part of our problem, that beef and lamb were, an outsized part of the problem, that agriculture essentially is now 2 of every 5 acres of this planet, and 3/4 of that is for animal agriculture. And that this was this land use issue that I had never even thought about.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me that if I hadn't thought about it, probably most people haven't. And there are a million books about energy and climate. So I figured, you know what, I'll do one about that other third of the problem.
Yeah, it was moving to me. I don't remember the exact statistic from the book, but when you talked about the percentage of articles about climate that even mention food or meat, it's like single digit, right? It's just unbelievable how fossil fuels dominate when so much of the problem is agricultural.
Yeah.
So
food is 3% of climate finance. And I like to say it's like 0.3% of climate conversation. So, and the thing is, we kind of know, like, energy is like, it's a big deal. Some of my old energy friends get upset at me because it sounds like I'm kind of poo-pooing it. But no, it's like fossil fuels are terrible and a huge problem. And it's still at this point a bigger problem than food. But at least we kind of know what we need to do. Right? We not got to electrify the global economy and run it on electricity. And we're actually kind of starting to do that despite all the, despite Trump, despite everything else. Yeah. Food, we don't know squat. We haven't even started working on it. It's still getting worse.
Well, you and I have all the answers. You mean everybody else doesn't know. So we'll get into that.
Of course.
Yeah. No, I mean, speaking of going electric, I actually saw just a couple of days ago something that was totally mind-blowing to me, which is that there are now more EVs sold in China annually than there are all cars sold in the United States annually, which is just like completely mind-blowing to me. And I would have thought that was completely impossible if somebody had told me that 10 years ago that would be true.
Well, people in China have more money than they did before. There are a lot of people. Yeah. And as we both know, the first thing people generally do when they start being less poor is they start eating more meat. Yeah. And that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah. Really interestingly, I also read that Chinese per capita protein consumption, not meat consumption, but Chinese per capita protein consumption is now higher than American, which is shocking to me. But they still only eat about half the meat per person that we do in America. And so they're just eating a lot of, non-meat protein, right? Like soy, like tofu, edamame, and other soy products probably. But that was pretty revelatory. I couldn't believe it, actually.
That's fascinating.
It was really shocking. So let me just get into the basic point of your book, because I read the book to cover to cover. It's a really great book, and it's very public policy oriented. There's a lot on like ethanol policy, which you make interesting. I thought like in the same way that like Michael Pollan tried to make like corn breeding interesting and the omnivore's dilemma, like you made ethanol policy interesting in this book. But it's clearly something that you care a lot about, as evidenced by you devoting this first several chapters of the book to this and the folly of biofuels from an environmental perspective. But let me just read you this line. I think is kind of like the thesis of your whole book, which you say, I'm quoting you here, you say, the greatest challenge facing our species will be to slow our relentless expansion of farmland into nature. Even if we quit fossil fuels, we'll keep hurtling toward climate chaos if we don't solve our food and land problems. So what is the land problem that you are referring to here?
Right. Well, like I said, I used to write a lot about urban sprawl. Right. About how our cities and suburbs are kind of sprawling into nature and how terrible that was. Well, all of our developed areas are about 1% of the planet's land. Agriculture is 39%. And as our agricultural footprint expands, our natural footprint shrinks. And that's basically our forests. That's the forests that store our carbon, the forests that soak up the carbon that we pump into the atmosphere with our fossil fuels. And so this is really the crisis. Of course, these are also the forests that shelter biodiversity. It's a problem. I say that trying to decarbonize the planet while you're, continuing to vaporize trees is like trying to clean your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You're making a huge mess, and you're also crippling your ability to clean up the mess. And that's what's happening right now. Agriculture is expanding, and right now it's on track to expand by another couple of Indias over by 2050. And we don't really have another couple Indias.
By India's, you mean the land space taken up by the country of India, not the human population of India.
Yeah,
right?
Like 12 times the size of California we're looking at by 2050. And so, people joke about how, the slogan is that there's no planet B. But for some of these projections, if we don't change our ways, we're going to actually need a planet B. And as we, those of us who saw The Martian, it's like not so easy to grow stuff up there. So,
maybe a better line than there's no planet B is there's no eighth continent. Maybe that's there's no eighth continent that we haven't discovered yet to start farming.
No,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, like, Mark Twain said, they ain't making any more of it. So
yes, they're not making any more land. That's right. Yeah. So, interestingly in the book, you hit on a point that I find a very compelling point, which is how, you're basically saying how we became very destructive once we started farming, right? Not after the Industrial Revolution. That certainly accelerated things, but you argue that actually, when even long before agriculture was invented, when we were still, I guess not, you're not arguing before agriculture, but you're arguing that basically before the industrialization, even the people who we would consider like First Nations or indigenous or whatever you want to call the people who were before Europeans reached America, that they were farming and deforesting quite a lot, so much so that they even when there was the Great Dying, that there was a mini ice age because there was such a heavy reforestation of the continent. Let me ask you though, it seems evident to me that the human footprint on eroding biodiversity even predates agriculture. Like when humans arrived in the Americas, there were major megafaunal extinctions. Every continent that we arrived on, whether it was Australia, America, Europe, there were megafaunal extinctions long before agriculture. So I guess my question is it us? Is it really agriculture, or is it just us?
Well, we seem to be really good at killing stuff, no matter, whether we're farming or not. It was really farming that really started to transform the landscape of our planet. And that's a really important theme for me. This idea, farmers get upset that my line that I say that every farm is a kind of environmental crime scene, right? Yeah. It's this kind of echo of the nature that it replaced. But that's not necessarily that's not an insult, because we got to eat. But the point is that this was a natural planet and it's becoming an agricultural planet, and we have not really grappled with that. That's what my book tries to grapple.
Yeah, earlier in the conversation, you talked about the portion of land that is used for pasture. And as you were saying that, I realized that you were implying that is bad, whereas most people, when they hear pasture, they think that is good, right? Pasture sounds good for the environment. But you're saying, no, it's not. Why? What's the matter with pasture?
Right. Well, I mean, all of these landscapes, I mean, there's an opportunity cost and there's a carbon opportunity cost to the transformation of, natural land, which was really great at storing carbon and really great at sheltering biodiversity, to agricultural land, which is better at making food, but not as good at storing carbon and sheltering biodiversity. And that's just a sort of general fact. And it is true that there are some forms of farming that are less offensive to the environment than others. But we have this kind of notion that there's kind of like kinder and gentler natural farming that's really good for biodiversity. And look, Michael Pollan is a really awesome writer, but I blame him for some of this. He's kind of fostered this kind of nostalgia, this romanticization of kind of old style farming that was more diverse, where the animals had names instead of numbers and the soil was treated very gently. And, the farmers kind of fed their, baled hay by hand, and these kind of modern industrial monoculture, chemical drenched, evil industrial farms that are bad and full of, and doing terrible things to the environment. And it's true that there is a cost of intensification, and there is a cost of these chemicals and fertilizers that, you see the dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico, or the algal blooms in the Great Lakes. These are problems, and and I'm not trying to hand wave them away. But the fact is that the real environmental catastrophe is the transformation of nature into those nice Michael Pollan farms. And again, and if they don't make as much food, if they make fewer amounts of food per acre, they are going to need more acres to make food. And that's how you get this situation today where we're losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest every 6 seconds. We need more food, not less.
Right. As you know, I refer to that style of what is now sometimes known as like regenerative agriculture. I refer to it as mythiculture, because it is like a mythical place where somehow you can produce less food on land and somehow it's better for the environment. And the myth that there's some proof that this is storing carbon, as opposed to, just letting a forest grow back there, right? Like, we think of a pasture as being natural. Like, you're talking about nature turned into pastures. I think a lot of people think that pasture is what's natural. Right. And in fact, these weren't pastures, right? These were forests. And they were deforested to turn them into pastures for cattle grazing. 40%
of the grazing land on this planet used to be forest. So, you definitely hear a lot from ranchers about how, I just, my cattle turn grass we can't eat into beef that we can, and this otherwise useless land or marginal land you hear a lot. But a lot of it's like 85% of Indiana used to be a forest. Right. So we kind of, wag our fingers at Brazil and Indonesia, and we say, like, this is terrible. You're deforesting your natural heritage. Yeah, it's kind of like easy for us to say because we cut down our Amazon in the 19th century. So, it's not like what we're doing is, substantively different than what they're doing. And
right. Whenever they call it marginal land, I always think, well, it's not marginal to the wildlife who would have been living there, right? Like they like for them, it was actually quite critical, not marginal. Okay, Mike, I want to get to this very provocative piece that you wrote where you were endorsing factory farming, and you weren't really just talking about animal agriculture. Like, really, if you read it, you're talking about high yield agriculture, right? So the use of synthetic fertilizers, the use of big tractors, like other things that are like industrial ag. So I actually think generally in my experience, maybe I live in a bubble, but in my experience, factory farms are generally what we refer to as like, animal farms, not necessarily like a major row crop of corn. But at the same time, you have been a defender of industrial agriculture in this sense. And I want to, you've also written pieces though, saying we need to eat less meat, right? You've written pieces that were celebrated by the, so-called like natural foodists, which is an eat less meat message. And then also pieces that were derided by them saying we need to embrace industrial agriculture. Explain yourself.
Well, the first thing I was more pushing high yield agriculture than necessarily industrial agriculture. Like what I always say is that if when it comes to the regenerative and organic forms of, trying to be gentler to the soil.
Mythiculture, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think it's entirely mythiculture, if I'm honest, and when I went to Brazil, I wrote about some ranches where they kind of combined. I mean, look, it's not like these ranches, Michael Pollan would have liked everything about it. They were fertilizing their pastures. They had feedlots, but they were also doing no-till and cover crops, and they were integrating their livestock with their crops, and they were using rotational grazing, lots of regenerative practices that, these guys celebrate, and they had kick-ass yields. And so that's great. I mean, because if you can make, they were in some cases 8-10 times as much beef per acre, that means they're using, 1/8 or 1/10 as much of the Amazon to make beef. And I think that's really important. But that said, I guess my critique of some of these low yield forms is, first of all, as you mentioned, the carbon farming aspect, this notion that, well, if we just farm gently and nicer and regeneratively, that all this, carbon that we've pumped up into the atmosphere is going to magically be repatriated into our soils. That's almost entirely bullshit. And I think, I see these movies, The Kiss the Ground and Common Ground. I see the UN and the World Bank talking about it. I see, Al Gore on the left and Joe Rogan on the right talking about it. I hear General Mills and Archer Daniels Midland and, you name your big ag and big food companies, and not to mention, half the environmental groups and major philanthropies. Everybody wants to make this idea of carbon farming happen. And at least on the soil side, it is really mostly bogus. And then the other thing I would say is just that, this whole idea of sustainable intensification, that the math really sucks. That even if, somehow in the rich world, we're able to reduce our meat consumption in half, and in the entire world, we cut our food waste in half, and we get rid of all those idiotic biofuels that I do devote, a couple of chapters to, we will still need to make more food with less land to feed a growing population by 2050. And unfortunately, that's happening at a time when climate change is going to be sort of a drag on yields. And a lot of the green revolution technologies that helped boost yields in the past, right? Like you mentioned, like fertilizer, like pesticides, like large scale irrigation, they have now been widely distributed. So we can't just do that again. You can't just give people more fertilizer because most of them are, using all that, they're already using as much as they can use. So we are going to need, a kind of green revolution. And the people who are saying the first thing we need to do is undo the first green revolution and have lower yields. I'm very skeptical of that kind of faith-based approach to transforming the global food production.
Yeah, and as you point out, they tried it in Sri Lanka, right? It didn't work.
Right.
It was just we'll include in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com what happened in Sri Lanka. But as you write, they tried to go organic, and it was a complete and total catastrophe. And I really liked what you said about this. It's kind of like communism, right? Like people always say, this is, it just hasn't been tried properly, right? And so that's so that the pro-organic folks will say that about Sri Lanka. Yet in reality, it's just very self-evident. This type of agriculture typically produces less food per acre.
I get that, and I don't want to downplay the problems with some of these chemicals, but the fact is that fertilizers help crops grow, and pesticides are really good at killing pests that kill crops. And that if you want to, get rid of all that stuff, you're going to have yield problems that you have to deal with. You can't just say we'll solve the problem by stopping food waste, or, we're just going to get everybody to go vegan, because, where's your plan for that? And I know
we've been trying, Mike. We've been trying. Sadly, it hasn't worked.
Well, I know, and I should say, because like I know I end up sounding. You kind of joked about this at the beginning that sometimes I can sound a little bit like an asshole when I talk about this stuff because, like, I know I'm the guy with the math. I'm the guy like pulling out the logic and the and the sort of the hard-headed numbers. And actually, I was asked. I did an event in Berkeley where this was like an auditorium full of foodies, and Alice Waters was glaring at me in the third row. And the moderator from the New York Times, she asked me, she's like, you're giving us all this kind of hyper rational answers, but isn't this a moral issue? And I was like, yes, this is moral. Like, these are like, climate change is a moral emergency. And I'm not, talking about, like, it's easy for people in Berkeley or for you and me to say like, oh, we want, I want my food to be grown in a sort of regenerative manner, or I don't want to eat this kind of like high tech food, or, I'm offended by these, these factory farms that make 99% of American meat. But the fact is, like, it's going to affect indigenous people living in the Amazon and poor people living in the floodplains in Bangladesh and smallholder farmers in Africa a lot more than it's going to affect us. It's like, this is really important stuff.
Right. And just, to keep it real, dozens of species go extinct every single day, primarily from habitat loss from agriculture, right? Like, you're talking about, well, what will happen to these groups of marginalized humans? At the same time, there are folks who have even less of a say in anything, which is wildlife.
That's right.
And dozens of species go extinct every single day, largely because of the expanding agricultural footprint. And for those of us who don't take a merely anthropocentric point of view, who we try to consider the interests of other animals as well, it's hard to imagine anything more of the moral emergency than what's happening here, right?
That's right.
Maybe Homo sapiens will go extinct, but we know for a fact that what we're doing right now is causing a mass extinction event. Now,
right, we've transformed the natural, like, the animal world from a wild world to a livestock world, right? I think I saw that now. I think the weight of livestock biomass is like 30-1 with wild mammals. Yeah. So again, it's like, this is something that most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about, because, like, maybe when we fly cross country and we see all the, like, the squares and circles out the window, and we're like, oh yeah, there's a lot of agriculture out there. But it's, we go to the supermarket and the food's right there. We don't really think about where it comes from. But there's just this, astounding transformation of our planet happening, in the areas where we're not paying attention.
Right. Those squares and circles used to be forests, right? I mean, that's the basic point.
Or like prairie and America's Serengeti. And,
So, okay. As you know, Mike, I am one of the people who cares a lot about animal welfare, including of wild animals who are going extinct because of agriculture largely. And you have been criticized, and you've talked about the fact that you've been criticized for not caring enough about animal welfare, because as you recommend to switch from beef to chicken because that's better for climate, it means way more animals are going to be farmed, and chickens are generally treated much worse than cows are, right? Like, if you had to choose between being a cow or a chicken, even if you were on a feedlot, every single time you'd choose to be the cow, not the chicken. So let me pin you down here. Where do you stand on the issue? Does animal suffering matter? Is it only the suffering of wildlife? Is it a biodiversity issue? Does the suffering of the billions of chickens who are raised for food matter to you? What is the Grunwald theory on this point of view?
I mean, I think part of what like I said, I have to kind of come clean and say that the people who care, like, more deeply than I do about animal welfare and have criticized me for not prioritizing it, they probably have a point. I think that, like, the people who say that in 50 years or 100 years, like, we'll look back at our current selves and be appalled by, that we'll look back at the way we treat animals, like the way today we look back at the way, we look back at slavery. I think that's very possibly true. And I guess I got to plead guilty a little bit. I have 3 dogs. They're annoying, but I love them, and I wouldn't eat them. And can I explain that? I guess this comes back a little bit to what I said earlier about how we all find the level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with. I'm I happen to be more focused on this idea that we're imperiling our planet, that we are imperiling our natural world, that we are ultimately imperiling ourselves. But what I would say to people who focus more on the animal welfare side is that like there's an awful lot in our Venn diagram that we agree about, right?
Yeah.
And that certainly, like, to the extent that we're both committed to this idea of alternative proteins and the problems of animal agriculture, whether it's, too many antibiotics creating a public health crisis, or, pandemic risks, or the crappy politics of the corporations that run these factory farms. We're going to agree about a lot of this stuff.
Right.
It's a fair point that I have sort of advocated this kind of like, just like the cows in the Chick-fil-A commercials who say like, eat more chicken. And I kind of think they're right, but it sucks for the chickens. And I did point out, like, my main character, Tim Searchinger, who also takes this kind of, efficiency based approach. But we were talking about Proposition 12 in California,
right,
where they've given pigs more room so that they can kind of turn around in their stalls. And there is an efficiency hit to that, because, you give them more room, then you need more room. And also, if they can move around, then they're going to use more energy and they're going to need more feed, and that's going to require more land. But it's a modest difference. And pigs were treated so horribly before, and this makes them treated less horribly, that even my kind of efficiency obsessed main character was kind of like, you know what, that's probably a reasonable trade-off. And I do feel that. And I can't tell you where to draw the line. But I'm for less cruelty. But people who say it's not my overriding passion, like they've got a point.
So you would have voted yes if you were voting on Prop 12 at the time?
I would have, yeah.
Okay,
maybe just because Josh Balk is in my head. I don't know.
You could not tell him if you had voted. If you were planning to vote.
It's true.
Sure. Okay, so I want to ask you, Mike. You talk about the Green Revolution, and you talk about all the associated gains that, if we hadn't had the Green Revolution, we would have needed several South Americas more to farm if we had been going based on the old yields that we used to get. And so you talk about fertility rates in the book, and you talk about how, beef consumption is going down in some places of the world, fertility is going down, and you imply that these are good for the environment. You don't explicitly say it. In fact, you do have a joke in there where you say you shouldn't euthanize your own children. But, even Norman Borlaug, who was the architect of the Green Revolution, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he gave a speech in which he talked about what he called the population monster. And he said, basically, he's bought time for humanity. But if we don't get the population under control, all the gains that he and others involved in the Green Revolution made are going to be for nothing, right? And so the population monster, which is, basically the fact that population tends to increase exponentially, and oftentimes food productivity, like agricultural productivity, doesn't necessarily increase exponentially. And that leads to real problems. So you're very explicit in your policy prescriptions when it comes to, getting rid of biofuels like ethanol, eating less meat, supporting high yield agriculture. Where are you on these fertility issues? Like, you talk about what leads to reduced fertility in the book a little bit, but do you think that, like, is it a poor message for people concerned about climate to say, hey, think about adopting children rather than procreating?
I mean, some of this, I think the messaging is kind of overrated, but look, I have found it a little baffling, this kind of like this idea that there's some like horrible crisis that the population isn't growing the way it was.
Right.
I mean, that seems to me.
What if the crisis is what if the crisis is the inverse, that we're going to go to 10 billion from 8?
Right. But it actually, it looks like it's not. It's actually leveling off. The kind of irony is that the reduction in our fertility rates and birth rates that I do describe, that's happening almost everywhere in the world except for sub-Saharan Africa. That is going to make a real difference in the population projections. The problem from a sustainability environmental perspective is that it's not going to make that much of a difference before 2050. And these climate issues, we really got to start making some progress before 2050, or things are going to get real bad real fast. And so even if birth rates went to replacement rates all around the world in a few years, it would only change the 2050 population and therefore the 2050 food demand by maybe 4 or 5%. A lot of it is already baked into the cake because there are so many women of child rearing age right now because of population growth in the past. That said, it turns out that there are really simple ways to decrease birth rates down to replacement rate. And they are really good things. It's things like educating girls, because educated girls tend to have, fewer children and starting at a later age. It's reducing infant mortality because, families in the developing world don't have to have 7 kids to make sure that 3 survive. And this, like I said, it's happening in all kinds of cultures. It's happening in Bangladesh, and it's happening in Botswana, and it's happening in Iran even. So it's not like, it only happens in rich places or it only happens in, Western places. It can happen anywhere with some better public policy. And I, of course, support those policies. I think when you talk about population growth, sometimes you end up sounding like you want to be Thanos, right? And just snap your fingers and half of all life on Earth disappears. And obviously, I don't tell people to have, for me at least, having children has been the joy of my life. It's sort of created meaning for my life. And I don't think anybody else needs to be like that, but I wouldn't tell people not to do it. Right. In fact, I always say have Greta Thunberg, have a kid who saves the world.
Yeah. In fairness, my guess is that people who adopt kids also find real great meaning in it. Even
sure.
If they didn't
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's awesome. And again, on a lot of this stuff, I try not to be prescriptive. I try not to be scoldy. You've seen, I've been very upfront about my own, I feel like perfect is not usually on the menu. Better is better than worse. Yes, and look, I have solar panels and an electric car, but I fly too much. I don't eat beef, but I still eat chicken. I'm not on an all lentil diet.
And maybe your flights are going to be powered by so-called sustainable aviation fuel soon, also, which will make it even worse. So,
get me started, man.
Yeah, no, I don't want to get you started on biofuels, but
they're bad. Can we just say they're very bad?
They're very bad. Okay, what do you think about burning trees for energy? No, just kidding. Okay,
also bad.
Got it. All right. Yeah, I was glad you mentioned Iran earlier about fertility rates there, because before we started recording, I joked to Mike that I was going to press him on his point of view on the Israel-Iran conflict, and at least he got Iran into this conversation. So now at least we've got that there. Okay, Mike, are there resources that you would recommend? Obviously, your book is a great one. I endorse this book. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. And we'll, of course, link to that so you can see where you can buy it, but you can buy it anywhere books are sold. But are there other resources in addition to your book that you think that people who are interested in this topic should check out?
Well, this, and I don't mean this to be as all consuming, but this was just when you mentioned that you were going to answer this question, I decided I was going to put in a plug, particularly for your listeners who know your background, is that Sentient Media, which they cover factory farming, and they come from a sort of animal welfare perspective. But I assume they're kind of funded by animal welfare people, but they just do great journalism. I found them to I've read a lot of great journalism, and in the book, I try to give credit to all these reporters who are on this issue way before I knew anything about it. And I give, kudos to all of them. There's a lot of good food and climate reporting, but I'm always impressed by Sentient, because I always feel like they're just doing journalism. And I'm sure the editors are hearing from their funders all the time, like, hey, why, this isn't biased enough. I found them to be a really good source. So I want to put in a plug for them, and maybe some of your readers will check them out.
Yeah, cool. I also read their news coverage and I appreciate it. So I'm glad that you brought them up. I'll also mention, after you're done reading Mike's book, We're Eating the Earth, I also think people might want to check out Rob Paulberg's book, which is called Resetting the Table, which is a really good look at agricultural policy with similar prescriptions as to what Mike is recommending here in terms of high yield agriculture and looking at the realities of what organic and the crusade against genetically modified organisms and so on are. And we actually had Rob on this show a long time ago. We'll include a link to that in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. So that's cool. Sentient media. All right. Is there anything else before I get to my final question for you, Mike?
Well, if you want to be a super dork, I do write about this World Resources Institute report that becomes like, I have a whole chapter about it that kind of, it's like 2019, but I think it's a little bit of a Rosetta Stone for some of this stuff. I mean, it's like 560 pages and like nobody in their right mind would read all of it. But I think skimming it is a good way to kind of get the broad sense of all the different, because again, like, my book has like dozens of solutions that are really promising, none of which are really, we're making a lot of progress. But if you're interested in learning the nitty gritty of biological nitrification inhibition and the idea of transforming crop residues into usable animal feed and, this kind of produce and protect approach that I sort of talk about for transforming global agriculture policy, I think this is like, it's a good overview, hopefully a little bit less entertaining than I made my book. But if you really want to get into the nuggets, it's called Creating a Sustainable Food Future.
Yeah, we'll link to it so people can check it out. It is indeed a good report, even if it is less entertaining than your book. So, Mike, you chronicle a lot of the companies. A lot of the companies who are trying to do really cool things, both in animal-free proteins, in improvements in fertilizers, and so on. Is there anything that you wish existed? Is there some company idea or some problem that you wish that somebody would take on that isn't being sufficiently tackled right now?
So actually, I did think of, again, like after you mentioned this, and this is not a specific company, but I guess maybe it's a venture capital fund that doesn't exist, or I don't even know if it's a for-profit or a non-profit. But like I said, there are just like
most of these for-profit startups make no profit, so it's actually they're all
exactly.
They're really nonprofits. Actually,
it can be an inadvertent nonprofit.
Yeah, all right.
But I do like what I just mentioned is like there's some guy in Nepal who is trying to turn rice straw into animal feed. Now, if he succeeds, now he's got he's unbelievably underfunded, but if he succeeds, obviously he could transform global agriculture because like we grow like 500 million tons of rice straw every year and it just, is mostly wasted. So there are all kinds of these solutions like that I write about, but they're not getting any money. All of the money right now from governments and philanthropies are flowing into this kind of agroecology craze where, I saw the Rockefeller Foundation and the Walton Foundation, they put out this report where they want $4 trillion into this kind of like kinder and gentler farming and whatever. Maybe somebody will figure out a way to make that work, but it's got plenty of money. And even alternative proteins, there are a lot of people working on it. Some of the food waste companies, there are people working on, but there's just this vast array of agricultural solutions that at least right now don't have a business model and they're mostly research and deployment. And I wish somebody would start a fund that, for a fraction of the money that the Rockefeller Institute and, some of these governments even these carbon markets are starting to pour into nonsense. I think like you could really start to move the needle.
All right. It's actually unbelievably coincidental that you mentioned this, Mike, because literally yesterday I finished a paper which is about the history of the use of Neurospora crassa in fermented foods. And Neurospora crassa is the organism that my own company, the Better Me Co, ferments into animal-free protein ingredients.
It's like the most studied fungus, right?
Yeah, I'm impressed that you know that. That's right. It's a good memory. But in 2016, there was actually a paper about converting rice straw into animal feed by fermenting it with Neurospora crassa. And yeah, it's really wild. And so I was writing about that study literally yesterday, like literally the day before we were talking about this. Now you're talking about rice straw as animal feed. So
maybe
anyway,
it's your company.
If there's any
your business model,
is there anything cheaper than meat than animal feed? Like we're already trying to compete on cost with meat. Now we need to compete on cost with animal feed. That would be
Can we find a less profitable commodity?
Yes, right? Exactly. Yeah, we need.
You get to compete with Cargill, which makes a quarter of a cent per ton.
I was just going to say we need a lower margin industry to compete against. Yes. All right. Well, listen, Mike Grunwald's new book is called We Are Eating the Earth. It's a great book. I recommend it, and I hope that you'll go out and read it. And Mike, thanks so much for all that you're doing to try to give humanity and the rest of the animals with whom we share this planet a fighting chance at surviving what we're doing to the Earth right now.
Oh, thanks, Paul, and thanks for all the great work you're doing. I've got big hopes for better meat.
You and me both.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.